Thanks for having me at the conference. It's great to be here again at GCGC. This is some joint work with Rüdiger Fahlenbrach and Ehsan Mahdikhani on a very related topic. It does involve those three big U.S. institutions because a lot of their common ownership comes from funds that are managed based on an index, which is what we're trying to measure. So let me start by how Rudi and I were first interested in this question. We had some ideas about how governance might be impacted in European firms by index ownership in ways that would be different from what happens in the US. And so for a couple of years, we spoke to investment bankers and practicing lawyers across Europe to figure this out. And they said, okay, now we understand the hypothesis. Let's just get the data. And we couldn't find it. So after having looked for a while, we concluded that there is no academically available source that says, here's the index ownership of this company. You could probably get pretty close in the US, but outside the US, we found nothing. So we said, maybe step one is just to measure this. For each firm, how much is owned by index-based investors? So that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, there we go. So according to a report from 2024, 18% of public firms are owned by domestic index funds. There might be some indexing from foreign investors, so the true number might be a little bit higher. But Chinko and Salmon say when you look at actual trading, when you include foreigners, hidden indexing, and so on, it might be as much as twice as much. So even in the US, which is by far the most studied, we don't really know super well for each individual firm how much is owned by index firms. What do we know outside the US? Well, there's a great paper by Kramers et al. From 2016. It looks at the mutual fund market, if you like, in each country. That's not really going to work for us because we want to know index ownership of Swiss firms, not the share of the Swiss mutual fund market that's managed with indexes. And for the US, so much of ownership is domestic. Maybe these are close. But for Switzerland or Belgium, that's not going to be the case. You could have a country where there's very little indexing in the domestic mutual fund market, but firms still have a lot of index-based ownership from US investors, for example. So this is a great paper, but it doesn't at all answer our question. So we're trying to figure this out, and I will show you a bunch of slides about how we did it. You don't really need to pay attention unless I tell you to. If I show you some of the method slides, it's more to show our effort. So what we do is we classify funds as index funds and ETFs, I should say, based on a quarterly panel of holdings and names. Okay, so notably, we don't require any third-party classification. We don't need to ask someone else to tell us what's an index fund. We don't need fund mandates, and we don't rely on regulatory filings, which are exquisite in the US, but much more limited in many other jurisdictions. Just the portfolio and the name. And that gives us a sort of global coverage of public firms. And here's a summary of what we find at the aggregate level. So index ownership globally from the early 2000s to just about a year ago has risen from about 4 to about 16%, so huge. Of course, the US is a really big part of this because so much of world market cap is in America that you might say, oh, what does it look like elsewhere? And I will tell you. You might also say, well, we're interested not in market averages. We want to know what number of firms, what fraction of firms have index ownership as a really important category, and that's the pink and red bars, and that's going up too rapidly and consistently for this whole period. There's now about 5,000 firms around the world where index-based ownership is 10% or more of shares outstanding. Okay, this is related to a big and interesting literature that I will not talk about anymore. Our data is from S&P Global Market Intelligence, mutual funds, ETFs, pension funds, public and private corporations, and other institutions. They claim 99.7% of global public and private companies, so it's basically all the firms. It is not all the owners. Retail owners, for example, are not there. But a lot of owners are. They have many sources. They claim to process about 1,500 documents every day. On average, we calculated this. This is 76.2% of owners. So it's a lot, but it's not everything. The retail are missing, for example. Yeah. Okay. We'll skip this one too. Let me give you an example. Here's a fund called X-Trackers MSCI Europe. It's a UCITS ETF. ETF means it's traded. UCITS is a regulatory category in Europe. From the mandate, look at the text highlighted in blue. The fund seeks to replicate the performance of the MSCI Europe index. So based on the mandate, that's an index fund. It also says MSCI Europe in the name, so the name also identifies it as an index fund. And so that's how we're going to treat it. Okay, here's a visual representation of our data problem. These are all the funds in our data. The portion of them, mostly in the US, are classified by Morningstar as index funds or not. Of those, some fraction are index funds. We're going to try to figure out what's the case for the rest of the funds, those that are not classified. And so we're going to use fund name and a probit regression model to identify which are index funds. We'll skip this, actually. Let me tell you, is the four variables we use from portfolio holdings. Number one is how many securities do you hold in your portfolio? Index funds have a lot of portfolios. If you look across the firms you hold shares in, what's the standard deviation of ownership share? That's because most index funds hold the same fraction of the market cap or the float in each portfolio company. So if that's stable, then you're an index fund. If you have low turnover, you're an index fund. And if you have similar changes in positions, think of an index fund getting an inflow, they will buy proportionally of all their holdings. When an active fund gets inflows, it could buy more over here and nothing over there. So we use these four variables together, and they're very predictive of an index fund according to Morningstar's classification. So here you see that the yellow corner, the lower left-hand corner, are Morningstar's index funds. And that's captured well by turnover and portfolio share variation. We can run it as a regression. We get a really high R squared. We don't need to think about the differences here, but the R squared are high when we put in all the variables. The fit looks like this if we use only the quantitative models. So index funds are mostly put on the, by the model close to 1 and non-index funds close to 0, but it's not perfect. Once you put in the name as well, we get really close to classifying everything that Morningstar classifies exactly the same way. So it's 97%. Now we can take this model to all the funds that Morningstar did not classify outside the US, basically, and decide who's an index fund and who is not. Here's the formula. We match 97%. And now here comes the interesting part. We have classified all the funds. We have all the ownership stakes. We can now aggregate up for each firm around the world what is total index-based ownership. So what are some questions you can now explore? You can compare levels and time trends across regions, countries. We can compare closet and explicit indexing. So how much of index ownership comes from funds that don't say index in their name? What are the indices used? And maybe what I find most interesting, if you look across firms, what is it that determines whether or not you have a lot of index ownership? Let me first look at the time series quickly. So this is a histogram of index ownership across all public firms. Most public firms are small companies. And you can see that over time, the fraction of firms that have trivial or no index ownership, the leftmost bar has been shrinking, and the distribution has moved down to the right. If you compare regions, the US has a lot of index ownership. Only a small fraction of US firms, something like a third, have trivial index ownership. Everyone else has a lot. Europe, less than the US, and Asia, less than Europe. You can look country by country over time. So this is value-weighted index ownership in European countries. Switzerland is at the bottom. That's because in 2023 they had more index ownership than anyone else in Europe. Bulgaria is at the top. Note also that the time trends are not the same. You have some cases where it's dropping. This is other examples, mostly from Asia, including the US as a benchmark. Japan has very high index ownership and rapidly growing. Contrast that with China that has low and stagnant index ownership. Israel has, starting from a very low level, rapidly rising. So also interesting cross-country differences. Because a lot of people in Europe are concerned about closet indexing, we looked at that worldwide. And I think the key factor is that since 2012, explicit indexing has been more important globally than closet indexing. So closet indexing grows, but it's growing very slowly, and it's completely overtaken by indexing that's explicit. Also, insider ownership has been overtaken. Okay, same fact. Here's maybe the most surprising finding to me. So this shows the size distribution of public firms across the world. Look at the gray histograms. Okay, so you have a few firms at the 100 billion euro and up range. You have quite a large number of small firms on the left. And then you have the bulk around 1 billion if you look globally. What is the average index ownership for a firm of that size given the region it is in? It's based in main listing. Start by looking at the US in dark blue. Interesting fact, the peak is not for the largest firms. The peak is for what you might call mid-caps. The very largest firms have slightly less, still a lot, but slightly less index ownership. I think that's probably the way it should be economically. Indexing is particularly valuable when it can put a lot of assets together in the same diversified portfolio. Everyone can own Tesla and Google, Alphabet, but the mid-caps is really the main target. But if you look at Europe and Asia, you have the red and green lines. If those colors look the same to you, then Europe is slightly above. The relationship is monotonic. So larger firms always have more index ownership than smaller firms. Okay, another way to phrase that is to say only the largest firms have significant index ownership outside of the US. Some governance implications come to mind immediately. So think about a large initial public offering. Suppose you're Spotify and your value is about your market cap is going to be about $20 billion. You'll be right here. If you list in Sweden, where you were founded, you might hope to get about 12% index ownership. If you list in New York, you might get 30%. So that's a strong incentive right there for mid-cap firms to list in the US rather than in Europe. Now, if you're a really high market cap firm, maybe it doesn't matter as much, but IPOs are very rarely that big. They happen, obviously, as recently. Okay. This is not new. If you look at older data, this hump was in the US already in 2013. So here's going back to 2006. You see the hump back then was a little bit to the left in the US, but it was still prominent. And if you go back to Europe in 2006, the level is much lower, but it's monotonic already. So I think that's a fundamental fact. I think it has to do with how indices are formed. Here's a hunch. Liquidity is a factor. I think mid-caps may not be sufficiently liquid in Europe for index providers to want to include them, or for index-based asset managers to want to use indices that include those mid-caps. There's also a free float question. So here's the distribution of free float as defined by S&P in the US and Europe. And you see there's a lot of firms in both regions that have close to 100% free float. Every share is trading. But there are more firms in Europe that are over to the left. So there's a significant controlling shareholder, and the float is much lower than the market cap. That is a strong predictor across shares of the amount of index ownership. So we have two important facts. One is the relationship between size and index ownership, how it varies by region. And then one reason there's less index ownership in Europe and Asia than in the US is because there tends to be less free float, and that pulls down index ownership. Okay, that's it. So country, size, free float determines index ownership. We get there by having a model that's 97% accurate in the US, so we think it works well everywhere. Index ownership is about half as high in Europe as in the US and half as high in Asia as in Europe, rising in most markets. Size works differently in the US, as I highlighted, and to be determined, but our goal here is to make this data available. We hope to publish a data file that says here's each firm in each year and here's how much index ownership it has. And we think this is going to be the main contribution of this research, is to help other people now start to think about the reasons for index ownership and the implications of index ownership. That's the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. Discussion will be Marco Becht. Marco?
So I've given this discussion a title, which is the Index Investing and Corporate Governance in the Age of Impunity. Now, the age of impunity is not my term, it's Elsa Roel's term to describe the times we live in, and that's the title. Now, what's the motivation? Well, we had the problem of 12, which you're familiar with from John Coates, and I think, Bo, you've introduced a new problem today, which is the index problem of 17%. So what are the corporate governance implications of that, the problem of 17%? Well, actually, we had discussed this before in 2018. So I went to the archives, and there is one thing, I need to get new trousers, okay? We had discussed this at a panel in Harvard Law School, and the motivation at the time was the Snap IPO 2017, who'd gone as a no vote to the market, and there was a question that was being asked, should they be included in the indices or not? And we had a debate, a very good panel there, discussion, and then Kobe, in his predictably productive self mode, he 1 year later wrote an article which came out in the Harvard blog called Corporate Governance through Index by Index Exclusion. And he basically said, well, you know, index providers hold a governance power, namely exclusion, they usually do not exert. So that was the thing, and, you know, but he and I thought that was a problem. Now, of course, at the time, the contractarians then argued, well, it's actually not a problem because you can choose a different index. So if you don't like Snap in your index, just click and get a different index. So that's the contractarian argument. And then the other argument was that large asset owners, you know, we talked about retail, and, you know, you got that question, GPIF, the GPIFs of the world, they can, of course, go to these index providers and say, make me an index. And the gentleman from S&P at the time says, you are CalPERS, you want an index? We'll make you one, okay? And it's true. GPIF went to FTSE and said, we'd like the Blossom Index, which is a version of the FTSE for Good, and lo and behold, FTSE made them the Blossom Index, which is FTSE for Good, except they include tobacco. Okay, fine. So that's the power asset owners have. So what's the problem? Well, then came, so, you know, Kobe, I'm sorry to say, that went into the bucket. You know, no people, you know, that wasn't egregious enough. Then we, of course, had the E question. You know, was Exxon, were the fossil fuel companies bad enough to be excluded from indices? And then we have, of course, the CalSTR's answer to that, which is, this comes from their policy, which is No. We want them in our index because we want to engage with them. And we are very successful of that. And here comes the kicker. Even if we're not successful, then if we divest, somebody else will own it, and they will not engage with them. And that's going to be even worse because at least we keep trying. So, the index, thus, for us, governance is also an irrelevant topic. Now, here comes, of course, the SpaceX enters last night, yesterday enters this. I really like this from the Financial Times, the Musk orbit. And now we are introducing a new world, which I'm sorry, Lucien, I'm being creative here, We go from the world of the unbound controller to the absolutist controller, because Jill already introduced the key features of this, absolutely unchallengeable. And I'm sorry to say, Dorothy, if you're here, no, she's not. But everything else we've discussed before, and Lucien alluded to this already, voting choice, engagement, do they engage, etc., is all completely irrelevant because the man is in charge and you can't kick him out. So all the usual stuff we have is completely irrelevant. So I'm sorry, CalSTRS, you can engage, you can sell it to somebody else, it doesn't matter. This is completely irrelevant now. What really matters is whether the stuff is in the index or not. Now, what have people said about, or what's the situation about index inclusion of SpaceX with the absolute controller in the indices? Now there, of course, the retail investors do have a choice because FTSE and MSCI have said they will change the index rules, and within the next 2 weeks SpaceX is going to be included in the indices. S&P have said they will stick by the rules, so it's going to take a year. So if you're a retail investor, you can switch your product and you can choose an S&P product, and at least there's going to be a year to see how this works out. You can do that at the click of a button. The people who can't do that as easily is the people that Ike already mentioned, is the asset owners. And Imeria, that's the people who are really behind what you are seeing. Here's my favorite picture of them. So let's just look at the top 5 largest, which is NBIM and GPIF, NPS from Korea, and I'm going to look at CalPERS and CalSTRS. And then there are 2 outliers, one from Sweden, one from Denmark, which are much smaller, I'll look at as well. So what's the situation with them? Well, first of all, you must look at what indices they track. So they're all index trackers. They use FTSE and MSCI. And as you just heard, the index rule are thus that SpaceX, if they don't do anything, will be included in their portfolio. Now, what have they said? Now, Korea and Japan actually don't have, so this is NPS and GPIF, they actually don't have an exclusion tool. They cannot exclude SpaceX from their portfolio. It will end up in the portfolio. They will give billions, well, we don't know the amount actually yet, but they will give a lot of money, they will invest a lot of money in SpaceX with the absolute controller, whether they like it or not. Now, NBIM, CalSTRS, CalPERS actually have an instrument of exclusion, and we will see over the next 2 weeks whether they use it or not. AP7, which is the 7th Swedish fund, they track MSCI, but they've given themselves a tool to exclude. And the only fund I found, Kevin, I'm also good at scraping, so I scraped, searched the internet. Is there anybody who said they will not invest they will not invest in SpaceX, will not include it in the index? The only people I found is Academica Pension from Denmark. This is their statement. It was actually reported. They are a $21 billion fund. And I asked Steen whether he's a beneficiary of this fund. He's not, because finance professors are not in this fund. This is the fund for social scientists, So this is the equivalent of the Guardian reading, tofu eating wokerati from North London, Is that correct? Okay, I got it right. Okay, that's the only people who said we don't want SpaceX in our portfolio, although we are an index tracker. Now, what about the price? Okay, so it popped yesterday, so it went up. So if you bought in before the IPO, you already got 135. It popped yesterday, so that's great if you got an allocation. The banks made 500 million, rumors has it. So everybody's extremely happy, except these people, because they'll be buying next week. So they're going to buy at the current price. So, you know, I'm sorry to say, if you have the choice of not buying this, if you are GPFG or you are CalPERS or CalSTRS, why would you buy this at the highest price possible? You must be, I'm not going to use the S word, but, you know, that's what you might be described as. Now, I'm not going to get into valuation, but if you look at this, just 3 reminders of maybe something you want to read. One is 1906, Frenzied Finance, about amalgamated copper. Then, of course, Patrick reminded me that there's the Minsky moment in climate, but maybe there might be a Minsky moment here. And then, of course, don't forget to read Paul Krugman's blog article on this yesterday about Ponzi schemes. So that leaves me with the conclusion. So the answer to absolute controllers in the age of impunity, divestment and exclusion, I'm afraid, engagement, it's just not going to work, and forget about the voting. Now, that's not the last slide. The last slide is, of course, a picture of the finance minister of Norway, because let's not forget Kurtis' paper from last year about geopolitics. Of course, the question is, should Norway, Korea, Japan, actually, or California have the courage to exclude SpaceX from the portfolio? What kind of phone call is going to be made and by whom? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco.
Yeah, that was super interesting. I have nothing else to add. Let's jump into the
questions.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I have a question concerning methodology. So essentially, you have this model whereby you have some factors, and then you use it to predict, whether a certain percentage of the ownership data set is indexed or not. But a machine learning person would do it in a very different way. So they would essentially be completely agnostic with regard to factors, and instead train a model on all factors, okay, with a regularization to prevent overfitting. And then they would predict, they would try to achieve the maximum possible accuracy, F1, AUC, some of those metrics, given what they have, right? And so this would be the usual kind of like train, validate, test, split, sample. So my question is, why don't you do that? So I understand that this is not microfounded. However, you can actually convert this to a model where it is actually microfounded by looking at the factors and decomposing them. So for example, let's say factors 1, 2, 3 are really important. You could link it back to your factors that you observe, and you could use your financial knowledge to make sense of these factors to say whether they're important. And if so, I think that would give you a much better prediction of indexing.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in terms of your hump graph for the U.S. versus the kind of straight line increase for other regions, how much of that is that individual investors are a larger factor in the U.S. market, and they're going to be concentrated with the largest issuers that have big brand name?
So, super interesting paper, and Marco, great comments. Bo, you said you were going to make available the results on the indexing of individual firms. Are you also going to make available your categorization of closet index funds? Because you may or may not know, but there's legislation pending in the United States that would require index funds to use mirror voting, and there's several current works in progress academic papers trying to analyze the impact of that, but they're just using the sort of straightforward, let's look at the name and decide who's an index fund and who's not. And so their results might be materially affected if they included your closet index funds in the affected funds.
Yeah, a great paper, great discussion. So, of course, Marco focused on the governance implication of the rise of index ownership. The finance implication is also interesting. You know, how does price discovery work when you have a growing share of the market, going into indices? And I have a suggestion for you for the next paper. You can look at the rise of indexing in the bond markets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 4 really interesting questions. I agree. You could use machine learning or you could use AI. Machine learning, I just mean more variables, or AI, something less structured. One thing that's convenient here is that we don't need a lot of text. We just need the portfolios. I think there's definitely a case to be made for getting to higher precision by using more data, by all means, and I think that's a worthwhile exercise and somebody should do it. Maybe someone who's better at machine learning and AI than I am. What I don't think is that you'll get a much better prediction because we get to 97%. So there's not much, left to gain. Might still be interesting and reveal things that we can't see. So I'm all for it, but I don't think it will kind of help you much if your goal is to say what's index ownership for global publicly listed firms. 2, the US hump. Why is there less index ownership in the mega caps in the US? Is it retail investors? I think it is retail investors. I also think it's founders. Bizarrely enough, some of the largest firms in the U.S. have really large founder stakes. That doesn't seem like the long-run way the world should work, but that's how it is. So I think that's a factor. I also think I spoke to some hedge fund manager about an active investor about the U.S. versus Europe, and he said, I will be much happier to execute some kind of trade in the share of Chipotle, not a big company in the US, than in Daimler-Benz, one of the largest companies in Germany. Why? Because liquidity is so much better. The market is so much deeper in the US. And so if I have a trade idea, it's going to be much more interesting to execute it in a smaller company in the US than in a big company in Germany. And I think that logic is also at work here, which is that the mid-caps in Europe or Asia aren't liquid enough for the index funds to really want to be there. Okay, so there's a policy implication there, if I'm right, that if you can improve liquidity, if you can make your market better, you can expand the coverage of index funds if that's something you want. Sharing data on closet index funds, I'd have to think about it. But my hunch is that we would mostly tell you about European closet indexers. We don't really add much in the U.S., but we might add a little bit. And so I think that I need to reflect more on that. Price discovery. Yes, Patrick, I agree. So you can say there's governance implications and there's price implications. I think there's also sometimes indirect governance implications through the price implications. So my example, the IPO is like that. So my prediction is that if you're planning a mid-cap public listing, one reason to go to the US is because there will be more index ownership, you will have a higher price. That changes governance then, because then you will be a US listed firm instead of a Sweden listed firm or a Singapore listed firm. So I think they might be connected. And yes, the bond market's something for us to think about for sure.
So a couple of different questions. One of which is, to what extent can the indexing variable in a country be taken as a proxy for either the quality of governance, well, or perhaps the quality of governance, as well as liquidity, in the sense that an indexer is passive. So basically, if you're a passive investor, you're essentially counting on there being sort of a base level of governance, stable. You aren't concerned about extreme shifts in value because of insider behavior or whatever. So to what extent can evolution and indexing over time be taken as a measure of improvements in governance over time, or similarly as a different variable, improvements in liquidity, which can be because of the improvement in market structure, or the willingness of family block holders to sell, et cetera, right? Separate question is, so Switzerland, the high level of indexing, as you've suggested, reflects a high degree of foreign ownership. So to what extent is that going to affect how firms are in fact governed? The objectives that they're, how the managers see their role. So for example, a foreign owner of a Swiss firm has no concern about the externalities in Switzerland of the behavior of these firms. And so that could affect how managers of a Swiss firm see the implications of actions that they have effects in Switzerland or not, right? And so to what extent is this indexing measure also a measure of sort of the intensity of shareholder value in a pure sense that could affect management behavior?
I'm interested in understanding the differences in the menus of indices out there. I don't know if you've looked at US versus Europe. In Europe, many firms have a plethora of different types of indices where they might attempt to enter: the national, the European, the industry. And I understand that many firms have understood the power of indexing and therefore have very specific corporate policies to actually make it into those indices. And maybe with your data you can differentiate the power of certain indices versus others.
I just want to clarify a little bit. So when you look at, for instance, China, so you looked at only the foreign institutional investors or also the RMB fund? I mean the Chinese yuan-denominated funds. But, you know, I also wanted to ask originally, you know, why do you see like in U.S., you know, index funds tend to focus more on sort of mid-sized type of firms, whereas in Europe and Asia it's different. I heard your explanation just now is sort of like the free float issues, you mentioned a little bit, but I was wondering, first of all, I don't know whether you can do sort of, you know, conditional sort of on the float, then you see what's the percentage of sort of ownership by the index fund. But I think whether there will be other additional sort of reasons for this, for instance, you know, whether it is the case that in certain markets you just have fewer sort of index products, you know, about these mid-sized firms. And also, I'm thinking about China, for instance, whether it will be because of the demand of these kind of index funds in the first place. Maybe in certain markets, the investors, they just like to, you know, get, you know, the big type of, you know, index the funds instead of, you know, more sort of targeted in the, you know, mid-level or small size. I'm just wondering what might be other reasons. Thank you.
Is it the size of the index fund industry in Europe versus the US, or is it just that European indexes, for example, are just harder to get into? You know, you have more governance restrictions. So I'm just wondering sort of how much that the 12 versus 30% is driven by the size of the sector. The other is that I wonder if there's a trade-off as well, that if you're an innovative company looking for price discovery, whether it might actually be a signal to go list somewhere where there's less indexing. Just a random theory thought.
Okay, yes. Governance, liquidity, foreign ownership, they probably all matter. I think especially if you have a U.S. frame of mind, or you're used to thinking about indexing in the U.S. context, once you go to all the other countries, with very few exceptions, indexing is all about foreign investors. And so a lot of index ownership in European firms is going to be U.S. investors who invest in Europe through an index fund that's Europe-wide, or Europe, Middle East, and Africa, for example. And so foreign ownership and index ownership are connected. And there may be a level of disengagement because of this too. So it's not just that BlackRock is index-based, it's that they're also American and they don't care about us in Portugal or the Netherlands, or wherever we may be. I agree. Yeah, there's a proliferation of indices. Actually, our method is not the best for figuring out which index you're following. We have tried something. I can tell you about it later. And one observation that jumps out is that the traditional domestic European indices that have 30 or 40 stocks in them, they don't really work well. And they're not part of the indexing boom. Okay, who wants to own an index fund with 30 French stocks? You're super lopsided in terms of industries. You're completely invested in France. That's not the index product you'd want. And so they're losing market share. They're not growing. So European type, Asian type indices are growing. Yeah, China, I'd be happy to talk more about it. In principle, institutions in China are part of our data. But what's the coverage? I don't know. Yes, and I think the domestic, if you're in Slovenia, okay, the domestic mutual fund market is not important to your index ownership. What's important is if you're included in some European index, and then where the money comes from, that's really hard to tell. In the European Union, you know, everything is in Luxembourg or Ireland, and what's the source of the money? I have no idea. And in part, that's the beauty of this paper, is we don't need to track the whole flow. We're just looking, we just need to know firm by firm. But for sure, most index investing in Europe is from other countries. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for the comments.